Hello.
Our story begins in deep space, aboard a Mandalorian cruiser. Satine's father, the current leader of Mandalore, sent his 12-year-old daughter away from the bubbling conflict to keep her safe. The society was on the verge of collapse. Keldabi, the current capital, was seeing riots, another sign that Mandalorians can live in peace up until they divide each other. An all-time powerful society at the breaking point, again. Satine didn't need to be a part of it in his eyes, and so she, with a crew of 43, traveled away from the capital. Satine and her younger sister Bo were aboard this vessel, a voyage of destiny. The trip didn't change Satine's life because of the coming war, or being removed from it. This radical change was incurred from a traumatic experience. While they were moving about in a system not far from Mandalore, they intercepted a vessel leaving hyperspace. The starship was crewless when it was located by the Mandalorians. Of course, being a kid, Satine didn't listen when the captain told her to remain inside of her quarters. The future Duchess of Mandalore rushed across the sky bridge into the other vessel, finding the ship to be empty. The guards were checking every corridor and finding no sign of life. These occurrences weren't necessarily uncommon, being how hyperspace worked and all, but they still had to search for life. The captain found himself at the bridge, and inside there was still no sign of the crew. They continued about for a bit, and at the same time, Satine, with an uneasy heart, rushed around the other ship in fear. These were horror stories meant to frighten little kids, often told by the bigger ones. She never believed them to be real, but as she broke into the bridge after running around for what felt like hours, she overheard the communication left behind by the crew. It stated that something was getting closer, before all of it was cut off. The eyes-wide Satine paused and watched the crew of her own ship try to diagnose the situation, before realizing she had heard this too. They were able to bring her back to her own ship and console her, but the terror of knowing what lay beyond the sanctuary of Mandalore was a defining moment of her adolescence. When she returned home, her entire world would be turned upside down. She pledged herself to the warrior ways, before her father was killed just days before she turned 13 years old. The safety of her home had died, and now, without either of her parents, she was forced to fend for herself. As per Mandalorian customs, she was the heir, and thus, she would be the leader of the future. Satine's childhood was ripped away from her the second she saw her father's lifeless gaze. Had she not experienced the fear of the unknowns outside of Mandalore, she likely would have chosen the route of pacifism. Not here, though. The scar of her father's death imprinted a desire to become more than any Mandalorian had before, and thus, the cycle of tragedy began. The next several years of Satine's life would be a revolving door. She'd be in tactical briefings with her father's advisors and generals, when she was barely old enough to even see the communication table they were looking over. She would watch Keldabi crumble under the weight of explosives, and be burdened forever with the sound of thousands of voices crying out as the structures buried them for eternity. Satine's place in this world and in this galaxy had been defined. During this conflict, she had lost contact with her beloved sister. Bo had a determination to be stubborn, and she risked everything to abandon the safety of Sundari, the new capital of the Mandalorians. By the time the conflict came to an end, Satine was a young woman, at the age of 16 and a half. Those halves didn't matter as much as they did before the war began, but it was the little semblance of herself she always kept alive, until the end of the war. She did have her interaction with the Jedi, but it didn't change how she felt about them. Because of her choice to become a warrior, she learned the extensive past, something she'd already been familiarized with. While she could come to accept Obi-Wan as a friend, she saw him for who he was, not what he represented. The Jedi Order was a plague on the galaxy, something that had also caused her people decades of unmitigated pain and suffering. Their ancient rivalry would perish under her hand. She determined it to be so, believing in the future she could secure her own people. Despite this, Satine's life for the past 3.5 years had been grueling. She saw the worst of people during this time. Clan Kryze was nothing but her own at this point, and she was dedicated to ensuring its longevity. Revenge sat on her heart, and as many know, revenge does wonders for the will to live. Instead of being hidden away, she had killed people. She had felt the gripping sensation of taking life beneath her own hands. Satine's armor had been casted for ceremony to appease the royal subjects. She wore ceremonial armor into battle, just to prove to her instructors that she was capable. The gold and white armor was a sight to see, and a very easy target, but it didn't make her any less fearful. When she claimed a life for herself, she knew that she had the strength to be what Mandalore needed. As her father once told her, it wasn't the Mandalorians that were weak, it was the disunion that destroyed them. If their society ever hoped of standing strong in the galaxy, they needed a leader to walk both paths. It was something Satine's father wished to teach her, as it had been requested of her mother before her death. With both of them killed, there was only hate in Satine's heart. Throughout the war, she trained harder than anyone else. She pushed herself to her limits, breaking bones and spars with grown men instructors, bruising her soft skin, and planting calluses on her fingers, knuckles, and palms. Just to prove something to herself, she'd spar with instructors without armor, facing an armored opponent with nothing but some tightened-up, thin fabric. Oddly enough, there wasn't anyone around her that craved this type of torture. It was simply her made-up belief that she had to make her dead father proud. She blamed herself for her sister's disappearance, and no amount of consolation from her peers around her would make her forgive herself for that. Satine dedicated herself to becoming the warrior that Mandalore needed. At the total conclusion of the war, Satine and her advisors, which some feared her more than respected, would come up with an economic plan for growth. Sundari was in ruins, the people were hurting, and once again, Mandalore proved why no one should do business with them. Satine had plans for economic growth, which consisted of giving and pulling, but also shady business. Clan Kryze had been ruled by fair leaders, individuals who, despite their strength, prided their coat of arms with intelligence and exemplary care. They, unlike many other Mandalorians, prided the unity of their people. Satine would too, but she would also do it with force. If there were those that rejected their push for a stronger society, they would face said force. With a little more than half of Mandalore's population dead in the war, Satine and the other Mandalorian advisors worked quickly to put their society back together. There was a priority of schools and academies. Satine believed that a smarter and more prepared society could stand the test of time. These schools and academies wouldn't just instruct lessons on history and their galaxy, but teach every soul who entered how to fight. If they didn't wish to fight, then they'd be forced. This society needed to be stronger than ever before. Outside of this, the young Duchess would push for more economic expansion. They didn't have a lot of money, so they would begin the first step of the plan that Satine created. Mandalore would unite itself with surrounding systems, planets that didn't have strong connections back to the Republic, and then they would build off of each other, establish a strong line of trust, and continue building upon it. These trade routes would help rebuild Sundari and grow their economy into a functional one, as Satine demanded, without a debt. On another note, though, she remembered something her friend Obi-Wan told her about during their 6 months together. Satine had gotten impatient and kicked the Jedi out of Mandalore for having done nothing. The soft spot for her was in sparing Obi-Wan for the blame, but Qui-Gon Jinn was too polite. This was a war, and he was too kind. It costed her thousands of people. Their lives would be avenged, and Qui-Gon specifically would pay. But point being, she remembered Kenobi telling her about a group of priests from a world called Doran. These barren doe sages were the key to expansion. Satine knew that the unknown regions were difficult to traverse without force guides, and these sages would do it for them. At the same time, though, she wanted Mandalorians to get involved with the underground network of piracy and criminal organizations. She dreamed of a society that looked presentable on the galactic level, one that no one would question because it was so perfect. Though the dark side of this governance is what it did to those that opposed them. The Mandalore dream wasn't for the faint of heart, and Satine made that abundantly clear. She demanded excellence, and she knew that her rivals wouldn't dare start another conflict until they thought that the young Duchess was weaker than they. Satine wanted connections everywhere, except with the Jedi or the Republic. Ironically, she already had herself a Jedi connection, but the young leader of the Mandalorians composed herself and dedicated every moment of her life to either training or expansion. This would be the first true Mandalorian Empire. After 2 or so years of constant around-the-clock work, Satine took her first true break. She and another man she became close with were speaking about the economic growth and prosperity of Mandalore. Jial Akbar, from the planet of Mon Calamari, was visiting her instead of Sundari. Yeah, she considered this a break, but he was delivering her a fresh batch of Mandalorian vessels. The new fleet was large, 4 capital ships with a number of frigates, cruisers, carriers, and so forth. As her advisors had predicted, her focus on academic work paid off. Hundreds of young men and women joined their cause. Funnily, there were more women who joined the fight than there were men. It was a useful marketing technique used by Satine. She went in with 2 slogans to encourage young women to join the Corps. The first being the full Mandalorian bitch. The second was the Angel of Sundari. Both were names Satine approved of and absolutely loved. She made these campaigns to target young women because early polling inside the first structured schools showed a majority of young men wishing to join the new Mandalorian military. In an effort to boost numbers on the other side, these campaigns were created. These came accompanied by posters plastered inside of schools and so forth. Though there was one thing about the full Mandalorian bitch that Satine did not like. She used a vibroblade in the art, and believed that the darksaber would be a more effective strategy. She was closing in on year 19 of life, and that was still an accomplishment she had yet to complete. Getting a hold of the darksaber could unify Mandalore, as well as encourage challengers to rise up. Her trainers kept her away from chasing the saber for the time being, because of her young age. They believed that she'd be a target because of how young she was, and some other factors too. These trainers had full belief in her, but they wanted to assure her success, no matter who faced her, which she could appreciate. She could be patient. Anyways, got a little sidetracked. She and Jial Akbar spoke extensively about the growth of the Mandalorian Navy. See, these ships were kind of loners. They weren't exactly fully bought by the Mandalorians, and they were in debt for getting them. Satine was basically working her ass off to make sure the Mon Cala became trading partners with the Mandalorians. Instead, she needed to put more on the table for this to work. So instead of dedicating all their landing bays to Mon Cala, they would scrap the trade route directly from Sundari to Mon Cala. Satine already had strong alliances with nearby systems from the past 2 years, which is why Sundari was semi-presentable in its current state. She couldn't lose those groups, so she wanted to allocate resources to a new location. This interested Jial, who was here to represent the Mon Cala monarchy. She expressed that in the past year her scouts had begun construction of a space station in the Yavin system. It was the 4th moon of Yavin. She expressed that no one had shown interest in Yavin since they arrived, and thus they were suggesting that a new space station be built there. She cut herself off, suggesting that it be a new shipyard instead. She told him to think of the possibilities. Her allies could send their resources to a relatively unknown system, which would grant them free trade without getting completely dissected by Republic trade laws. Akbar wasn't entirely thrilled about the prospect of lying to the Republic, but he could agree that even for them, those trade laws had been brutal. Mon Calamari was on the furthest west systems in the galaxy. They had to pay unbelievably high taxes on trade, which was unfair due to their location. It's why they avoided trade within Republic territory, or barely at all with the actual Republic. He did understand why this was proposed, and he accepted her terms, though he believed that Mandalore should be responsible for building the shipyard. Perhaps that would make them even for the fleet that Mandalore now held. Satine just smiled and winked at him, before bringing him to the throne to finalize the proposal to send to the Mon Cala monarchy. The new military at Satine's disposal, with a remarkable fleet, were able to act on some early plans. With a group of Barrando sages kidnapped from their home world, the Mandalorians descended into the unknown regions, using smuggler routes, and a couple of other backroad hyperspace lanes to avoid Republic detection. Thanks in part to all the Mandalorian criminals, the government was able to gain important information on how to avoid the Republic. The only trouble for Mandalore was how the Republic personnel were worried about these Mandalorian bounty hunters, because they were especially prominent because they were really good at their jobs. The Duchess just simply denied any relation or connection to any of them, which was part of the risk these Mandalorians accepted before becoming criminals. Satine wished that she could be a part of the move into the unknown regions, but her responsibility was here on Sundari. The deal with the Mon Calamari was especially important for her. Her allies would be key to quickly building the shipyard at Yavin 4. There was a reason so many systems, and therefore their governments, were willing to accompany Satine with this. It's because they had been screwed over by the Republic too, and they could seize advantage in non-Republic territory. Inside the unknown regions, Mandalorian warships discovered civilization after civilization. These people were not very happy to be located by galactic citizens. The Mandalorians were sent with two objectives: find allies and destroy those who didn't want to help. While the Mandalorian fleet wasn't very impressive, its leader and their warriors were. The fleet was operated by one of Satine's father's best strategists. He was an elder man and never wore Mandalorian armor unless in battle, but he was a cocky bastard, and he held very little regard for sentient life. Their skirmishes would be fierce. Because they did not know the unknown regions nor their territory, they just showed up near and around new systems. The sages that led them here didn't direct them to any known locations, so it was one pop after another. These battles had many Mandalorians dying, but they did so with honor and duty. Each of these fighters were formidable despite their young age. Cruisers participated in bombardments, soldiers captured the masses, and the Mandalorian Empire slowly expanded, week by week, across the unknown regions. There were those who agreed to peace terms, and those who would need to be subjugated. The reality is, the Mandalorians did not make a popular impression upon their entry into the unknown regions. This mostly had to do with the fact that these people hadn't assimilated, so they weren't necessarily fond of anyone that wasn't them. More battles transpired until they were met by a group of fierce fighters from Scylla, who wished to gain speaking terms. The Chiss weren't known for being open to anybody. They were untrusting and very hostile, but this force of Mandalorians had ravaged most of the generational rivals of the Chiss. They didn't fear this force, but they were interested in it. The legendary Mandalorian commander would agree to a term, which would send two spokespeople from the Chiss to the galaxy to discuss these occurrences in the unknown regions. Thrawn and his sister Verica would leave to represent the Chiss on Mandalore. This, of course, was not a surrender by the Chiss, and they certainly had no problem with waging war with this dominant state that plunged into their territory, but curiosity was an initial need. The Chiss recognized something important about the situation. These new invaders were unfamiliar with the unknown regions, and if, say, the Chiss took this potential threat and offered them a chance of recourse or even peace, then they could assemble their forces in case things didn't go as per plan. Thrawn and Verica were both volunteers, but also potential sacrifices. The Mandalorians had been otherwise ruthless in their approach to the unknown regions, but the Duchess welcomed any chance for actual peace to take place, so the Chiss used this opportunity in case anything devolved into conflict. To their surprise, they would be welcomed by the illustrious Duchess that was referenced. As a side, the Mandalorian fleet abandoned Scylla and visited some neighboring systems to expand their territory, but the Duchess, she was on her own mission. The nearly 20-year-old leader of the Mandalore was taking troops to the nearby moon of Concordia. The darksaber was her birthright, and she was going to claim it. When they landed on the moon, a skirmish began, because their entry was thunderous. Their warriors poured out of their gunships and fired away at the unprepared Death Watch members. Many of them weren't even wearing their armor, and Satine had one order: kill or capture. She wasn't here to be friendly with a clan that tried to dismantle their society. These were people responsible for the death of her father. She rushed out, firing a set of pistols before shoving one into her hip holster and igniting a blade to strike her opponents. Death Watch attempted to ready itself, but their camp was bombarded when another one of Satine's gunships sped over the camp and released a dozen-plus troopers. They used their rocket packs to rain hell down on their enemies. Pre Vizsla was unable to conjure his troops up for battle, and he watched them fall by the tens. They were slaughtered, and without even having a chance to fully grapple this reality, Satine charged him. The golden armor was identifiable from a mile away. He readied himself, pulling the darksaber from his tent and raising it, but she already jumped, using her jetpack to boost herself into his stomach and launch him from his feet. Vizsla slammed into the ground, rocking his head and his fugly little mohawk into the dirt. Satine fired her pistols, moving diagonally to avoid any counters. Pre kicked himself back, avoiding what he could and protecting himself with his armor for the rest. As he reached the legendary saber, he lost sight of the Duchess. He readied the weapon and didn't see her until he heard her jetpack ignite. When he turned around to face her and stop her from potentially killing him, she was nowhere to be seen. The arc of her jetpack could be seen rocketing into the sky though. From behind, a sharp pain shot up his spine. a dagger right in the soft spot of his armor. He unreadily swung back to defend himself, and she by this point, having left the other dagger in his back, launched her foot into the rear of his knee. On her boot was equipped a poisonous blade, one that struck blood. The Duchess slipped away from the raging swings before taking her helmet off and throwing it forward into his strikes. The pure Beskar created a deflective shield that threw his arms behind his head, and she rolled her grapple out and fired it. The thin but strong wire whipped itself around his neck, and she dragged it down, forcing him to bend before her feet. By the time Vizsla realized he was being choked to death, he noted that his clan had been killed or were being forced to surrender. They weren't able to do anything else. Satine pulled his darksaber and ignited it. His next of kin was brought before her and executed, so that Vizsla in his final moments could understand what his pointless war brought to Mandalore. Meaningless death. If she was going to be a true Mandalorian, then each death would be for a reason, not to be thrown away for some self-vindicated purpose. She slammed the saber into another soft spot in his armor, and the next person brought before her was her beloved sister. Bo had betrayed her family, and she asked her lovely little sister if she still pledged loyalty to these terrorists. Satine spat out those words as if they stung her tongue just to say them. Her beloved sister cowered in fear, not having seen what she had abandoned. Her oh-so-sweet older sister had transformed, and Bo had left her without an answer. Satine ended pre-Vizsla with the saber his family held for decades or centuries, before his head rolled in front of Bo, and she too joined her cowardice leader in the afterlife. Satine turned to her men and women, her soldiers, and then told them that to have a perfect Mandalore, to have a strong Mandalore, they needed to make sacrifices. She asked if they would be willing to sacrifice those they loved to have a pure society. Chants rolled out, calling her the Mandalore. Her eyes scanned each cheering member of her army, and she smiled. Satine grabbed her helmet and rolled her fingers, which insinuated that those who surrendered were to be executed. Her commander following the battle would be sent to the other clans, offering them the ultimatum to join. He bowed his head and took his own elite with him to confront the other clans. Upon Satine's return to Sundari, she would be unrecognizable to what her soldiers had seen. She slipped into her fluorescent dresses and displayed the Duchess head garment, her voice without a hint of rasp, and her eyes keen on telling anyone what they wanted to hear. She was as soft as an angel, and she promised her Chiss guests that they could have a total agreement. Whatever their people wanted, her people would guarantee, as long as they remained allies. Thrawn and Verica were completely unaware of what this beautiful woman had just mercilessly done a moon away to her own sister and to Vizsla, and so they accepted her proposed treaty and returned to their homes with it. The Mandalorians would not press them, just allow them to make their own choices. What their agreement would eventually bubble over to is the Chiss would exchange technological advancements and supplies for trading partners and protection from the Mandalorians. They would also be the first system Satine considered a province of Mandalore. Essentially, a part of this deal included the Chiss having full governance over the unknown regions, which was a no-brainer because Satine didn't want to employ legions of troopers in that territory, just have enough influence to make the other systems bow. And thus, their empire expanded to the unknown regions, as the Chiss identified the hidden hyperspace lanes used by the Mandalorians as main routes to the known galaxy. Without a need for the sages, the Mandalorians would gleefully return them to Doran. They promised security, and they left without incurring fear, giving no reason for the sages to contact the Jedi. Not that the sages knew who kidnapped their peers anyways. By the time the blockade over Naboo transpired, Mandalore was seen as a prosperous society. Satine, at the age of 24 now, was seen as the leader of the future for having rebuilt her people from the ground up. It had been nearly 10 years since her imperial plan started, and they were going swimmingly at this point. She, of course, was still training and using the darksaber, but she had dedicated more expansion work to her allies. Aside from amassing a small alliance with her use of private shipyards over Yavin 4, which was constantly expanding, Mandalore had quietly been taking star systems. Thanks to the fully transparent alliance with the Chiss, 75% of the Mandalorian fleet was pressing to the western part of the galaxy. This fleet was much larger thanks to the alliance with the Mon Cala. The other 25% of this fleet was in the unknown regions. The Trade Federation obviously made a mockery of themselves, but the Mandalorians specifically targeted systems that weren't important to the core. The larger, more established government didn't value everything the smaller coalition needed, so these systems typically transitioned into Mandalorian quote-unquote colonies really well. Not that they believed in the rapid conquering of the galaxy, but being a part of this coalition was better than remaining perpetually loyal to a republic that didn't even notice their disappearances. It was a funny mix of willingness and also submission. These Mandalorians weren't what they paraded on screen. Duchess Satine could win your heart with her charming smile and her cheerful demeanor, but the society she built was quite the opposite. She showed off an academic society built on brains, when in reality it was founded in brawn. She meshed two worlds into one, and in doing so, encouraged dozens of other systems to request trade agreements with them. As a result, with all of their financial assets, thanks to the Yavin shipyards, they built a new trading outpost over Mandalore itself. This came accompanied by defense towers in the form of Golan platforms. The young and prosperous society had a secret edge, and no one was wise enough to detect the dagger until it was already at their throat. And at this moment, they had extended their arms out to the system of Banadan, which was the most northern and most western star system in the galaxy, aside from Midas, which was also on their list of interests. Mandalore had saved themselves trouble by conquering these systems. Banadan was vying for a position inside the Senate, and now they had official recognition with another group. The Mando Empire consisted of 40 or so conquered systems, which all maintained their own sovereignty, like the Chiss, while another 14 strong systems traded over Yavin. An additional 32 systems were in a trade agreement with Mandalore. This trade was going straight through Sundari with no lines attached to Yavin. And lastly, there were 17 systems and/or planets that were fully captured by the Mandalorians. This was a true miniature empire, and the Republic was none the wiser. The real change for everyone didn't come until a couple months following the change in leadership for the Republic, when at the age of 25, Satine's people were approached by the new Count of Sereno. He informed them that he planned on building an alliance, but there was something off about everything he spoke about. Satine, of course, showed off her beautiful dresses and maintained the upper-class accent for discussion, but she could feel that something was wrong here. In either timeline, Satine would have rejected Dooku's proposal for forming a coalition, but something rubbed her especially wrong. She knew the former Jedi Master turned politician, so when their little talk ended, a bundle of Mandalorian warriors would ambush Dooku. He held his head high and swung his new crimson saber around to defend himself, but it would prove to no avail. His mastery of swordsmanship couldn't compare to the gang attack, which included a few parries against the darksaber. Satine and her warriors gutted him, removed his head, and investigated his vessel. They learned crucial information from Dooku. Inside of his solar sailor was information on his master, Darth Sidious. The Mandalorians had a history with the Jedi and the Sith, and in knowing this, Satine made a judgment call. As a side, Dooku only left this information available because he, like Palpatine, was under the belief that the Mandalorians were just a functional society rebuilt from civil war. Neither of them knew how deep their control ran. By killing what they thought was a threat, they would create a new one. The Mandalorians would deposit Dooku's head at the works for Sidious to find, and a warning for the Sith to not draw any closer, or the Jedi would learn of Palpatine's true identity. The Mandalorians wished to be left to their own devices, by threatening someone who knew nothing of their empire to begin with. Dooku was set for the future CIS, not for the Mandalorians' apparent coalition, and because they knew the truth, Sidious was stuck. He couldn't attack them, or the Jedi would know who he was. Even worse, the clone army was created by a Mandalorian warrior who worked as a bounty hunter, undercover for Satine's government. Surely, they all knew that something was up. Satine hadn't been informed yet, but that would be in her annual report from Jango Fett. So for Palpatine, everything was against his favor here. He couldn't do anything but watch helplessly. Sidious couldn't hurt the Mandalorians quite like they could hurt him, and if they managed to kill Dooku, then he would risk putting himself in danger by going to their planet to face her. Though he had an idea. Sidious would send the Trade Federation after the Mandalorians, and then he would kill that little duchess of theirs. It would fail tremendously. And the Mandalorians wouldn't just capture one of their fleet commanders, but they would steal 2 Lucrehulks in the process. The Sentinel, as he was referred to, a Nemodian, would be gutted on the ground, and also sent back to Kid and Amodia, warning them that if they tried to make a move again, they would all perish. No one knew this move came from Palpatine, but it did have the Mandalorians curious in who sent these Federation bastards. Following these two back-to-back moments at home, Mandalore wouldn't face any more true threats. Sidious had to look for another apprentice, which eventually became Maul again. And he also needed to find someone to operate the clone army that wasn't the Kaminoans, because of some issues at Tipoca City. Jango had given them a bad blood sample, so all the clones came out looking like smushed boneless creatures, not even comparable to human beings. Everything was collapsing, and Mandalore had him by the family jewels because he couldn't do anything without being exposed. It didn't matter for Mandalore though. They continued trotting along. Despite Palpatine abstaining from reacting, he did do something to try and help himself. He suggested, firstly, that the Jedi involve themselves near Mandalore, and he secondly passed a minor military creation bill to protect the Republic from the criminal empires. It was a legitimate threat, though they didn't fully realize how much of a threat these criminals were. Satine, despite loathing the scum of the galaxy, saw their usefulness. She used her prided society as inspiration to these criminal families. She'd often use her Mandalorian bounty hunters as tricksters. They'd suggest loosely to the Hutts, Pikes, or Black Suns the little, "Did you see what Mandalore did?" And it worked like a charm, because away from the core of the galaxy, everyone kept tabs on each other. These crime families knew that Mandalore was doing something. They didn't realize how deep it went, and this was only them seeing the in-galaxy work. No one knew about their unknown regions work. This prompted the families to mobilize and recruit heavier. They needed to have their own militaries, but it wasn't in fear of Mandalore per se. Look, everyone knew that the Republic didn't care about criminal territory, so Mandalore had free reign to march in and take it for themselves. It was clear to these leaders that they weren't being targeted because the young Duchess wanted an unspoken agreement. She didn't encroach on their territory, most of which not having been conquered yet. It was her way of signaling to them that they should prepare to conquer their own little territory. And because of how silent Mandalore remained while taking territory, it would never be on the radar for the Republic unless the crime families did something, which is something she hoped the crime families would overlook. Luckily for her, they did. Despite this, a problem was arising. Many territories that fell in line with Mandalore started reporting Jedi activity. Planets that were considered colonies, or not allowed to run on their own, were forced to remain silent. But nothing can last forever, so a few of these Jedi would disappear. Among the several Jedi sent to investigate this territory was Obi-Wan. He hadn't started individually training Anakin yet, so he was alone with another Jedi Knight on this op. When he arrived at Sundari, he could see how much Satine had rebuilt the society, but he wasn't really welcomed in the same way he thought he would be. He and the Duchess would have a very pleasant discussion about the changes, but there was an uncertain edge to his friend. He tried to crack her open, but it led to more tension than needed. This wasn't just a girl fighting for her life. This was a woman fighting to maintain her empire. It eventually bubbled over when he started asking if she knew anything about the activity west of Mandalore. Without even having a chance to react, he was clocked in the throat with Beskar knuckles she hid in her sleeve. He never had a reason to be on guard, and he was completely unprepared. Her security detail prepared to activate, but she waved them back, activating the darksaber and planting it below Kenobi's chin. She told him to take his Jedi colleagues and stay away from Mandalore. Satine remarked that she hoped that he could be indifferent, but clearly that was not the case. And while it could be seen as mercy, she was only allowing him to survive his trip back to Coruscant because he needed to deliver this message to the High Council. Obi-Wan, though, would be the catalyst of a new Jedi and Mandalorian war. It wouldn't be nearly as large as the previous ones, because the Order had no clue what Mandalore had at its disposal. Of course there were some hints, but even Obi-Wan couldn't tell them what they really had. The Jedi were escorted by a miniature Republic fleet. This, thanks to Mandalorian bounty hunters, would open up the floodgates. Just as the Republic entered Mandalore's airspace, the Golem platforms activated, and a hidden fleet emerged from behind Concordia. As the battle started to take place, Mandalorian allies saw the Republic as aggressors, something that would spread across the stars like wildfire. On top of that, the bounty hunters informed their criminal leaders that they should unleash war on the Republic because of what they were doing at Mandalore. But before any of that could fully transpire or work out, the Republic fleet would be beaten. With a number of Jedi counselors present, with Obi-Wan, the Jedi intended to make sure Mandalore returned to its neutrality. On the ground, these Jedi would have stood a chance. But massive cruisers rolled around Concordia and fired down on the much smaller and weaker Republic cruisers and corvettes. It certainly didn't help that the Mandalorian tech included mastery from Mon Cala and advancements from Scylla. The Chiss and Mon Calamari helped create a monstrous force. Torpedoes, rockets, and turbo cannons unloaded, rattling the Jedi and their Republic allies. There had been a treaty established, and the Jedi threatened it by bringing their little fleet here. It was a massacre. Not a single member of the opposition fleet would survive, and not a single Mandalorian fell. Along with these kills were Masters Windu, Plo, and Balaba. A number of Jedi Knights, including Obi-Wan, would be claimed in this battle. It would be considered a terrible loss of life, one in which Satine would warn the Republic to never involve itself in their affairs again. She felt some shame in Kenobi's death. He had been a fair friend to her when they were children, but seemingly his idealistic approach to the world hadn't changed with the times. She also would send a message to the Jedi Temple with Jango Fett, the mastermind of destroying the Clone Army project, that would give the Jedi her proof for Sith existence. In this message, she informed them that she had hoped to blackmail Palpatine so that he might leave their society alone. At this point, it became clear that the Sith had only one goal: destruction. Satine earnestly hoped that they could come to a resolution without having to involve another casualty count as was seen above her system. The Republic lost nearly 1,300 naval crewmen and women, including nearly 25 Jedi. Just as she had hoped, the Jedi would make their move on Palpatine, and just at the same time, the three largest criminal organizations would move to take their slice of the pie. Mandalore, inversely, would expand northeast to conquer more territory forgotten by the government. She, as a protection, sent a reinforced treaty to the Republic, the same one that had been in effect for over a century before this incident. It would be signed as the Republic grappled with losing their Chancellor, an apparent Jedi rebellion, and the militarization, which was not prepared for the criminal assault. The next 3 years would be a revolving door of problems for the Republic. The crime families took most of the attention away from Mandalore. The incident over Satine's world was deemed as a faulty decision by the Republic by its citizens. The Mandalorians were neutral in the eyes of the public, and the Republic had no business being there. Of course, there were those that were vengeful, but clearly there were larger threats. Almost every single battle transpired between the Republic and one of the crime families. They couldn't really catch a break, and rapidly, systems were fleeing the Republic to join Mandalore's coalition, because the crime families weren't touching them and because Satine showed that they could protect themselves from any threat. Due to this coalition, furthering the distance between itself and the Republic, more shipyards were openly built, some for trading, others for warship production. The crazy thing is, despite Mandalore's still relatively small population, they were the fiercest warriors in the galaxy. And now with the power shifting away from the Republic, she made a move that would forever change the trajectory of Mandalore's imperial aspirations. See, Satine didn't want total control over the galaxy. She just wanted a Mandalorian Empire, free from internal civil wars, and she would have it. Thanks in part to her coalition, volunteers across every star system would join the Mandalorians on their crusade into criminal territory. It had been a long talking point between Jial Akbar and the Duchess. Now that it was time for the next part of her plans, they assembled a military force larger than anything the galaxy had seen in over a millennium, and they bashed through the upper part of Hutt territory. Thanks to Admiral Akbar's and Commander Thrawn's assistance, the coalition was able to split their forces and completely dismantle the Hutts. Again, due to Mandalorian bounty hunters being positioned within their criminal ranks, it was the perfect espionage. They reported stronghold locations and countermoves before the Hutts could even grapple with what had hit them. It was a merciless dissection of the defenses, and then it all became clear to the Republic what had happened. They had made themselves out to look like a bunch of bumbling fools, while the Mandalorians swept the criminal syndicates with the overly powerful military they created, and offered something the Republic could not: protection. Mandalore or Satine actively created a necessity for every system, and then they provided it. On a smaller scale, it's what Satine had been doing throughout this entire time with empire building, and now it was just a matter of time until she and her people swept through the other criminals. They didn't have the wherewithal to align themselves with one another, so one by one, each major crime family was crushed. Also, one might think that Mandalore got rid of the slaves, and they didn't. They would continue working for the betterment of the new regime, until the leadership deemed it necessary to move on from such barbaric forms of labor. In all fairness, these slaves would be given payments for their service under the Mandalorian banner, but for now, they remained as slaves. The Republic was therefore, after watching the Mandalorians crush through system fleet after system fleet, forced to make a decision. They didn't have the power to stand up to Mandalore, and the galaxy was now split down the middle. Ironically, Satine's aspirations didn't care for total domination of the galaxy. She could win a full-blown war, she knew that, but in her mind it wasn't really worth the risk. So she told the Senate to consider the treaty they had made, and leave it alone. But the problem is, so much of Mandalore's new territory now included systems, planets, and resources that the Republic was actually interested in. No longer was it just minor locations with replaceable supplies. These were systems that held value, but could no longer be reached because they couldn't afford a war with this coalition, and they wouldn't trade with the Republic. The worst part is, there were senators with delusions of grandeur, believing that they could amass a military under the noses of the new dominant power in the galaxy. But Satine never took her foot off the gas. This was a fully realized militaristic society, one built in ideal beauties, such a which would push the galaxy into its own renaissance. In the meantime, though, instead of Sundari, heroes would be welcomed home. Individuals who weren't born of Mandalore or held within the clans would be brought back and welcomed as Mandalorians. Some honorary non-Mandalorians being Akbar, Thrawn, Verika, and a few others from over the years. Jango Fett, including other bounty hunters, commanders, admirals, and warriors, would be honored as well. These people helped reignite the flame of Mandalore's great growth. As a part of Satine's focus in this new order, she allowed systems without rebellion to govern themselves. It was more like a strong monarchy overseeing several provinces and colonies. Those referred to as colonies would eventually reject the Republic and dedicate themselves to the Coalition. The Jedi, in the end, would reject staying on Coruscant and find their own path in the galaxy. Being that Mandalore eventually outlawed slavery, had a bigger military, and had no intention to wage total war, there was no reason for the Republic to try and confront them again, especially because it didn't work out so well the last time they tried. Anakin Skywalker, who lost his supposed-to-be master to the Mandalorians, wouldn't be affected much. He and Kenobi didn't have much of a relationship, and anyways, Yoda oversaw the rest of Skywalker's training, so he never became geared towards revenge against the Mandalorians because of it. A sickly and ghastly death for Kenobi, never truly remembered by the boy he promised to train. The identity of Mandalore remained founded in combat and in warrior traditions. While art and beauty would grow and prosper in the coming decades, Clan Kryze would ensure that society flourished in the Mandalorian way. She would find herself a husband and have an older daughter with a younger son. These children would be raised and trained as Satine was following her own father's death. She knew that Mandalore would never rest easy, unless those under the monarchy were capable of defense. Something that flew under the radar during the ascent of the Empire was her having to fend off the darksaber, and thus her throne, numerous times. It's why she waited so long to even consider kids with her current partner. She had a partner in her mid-20s, one who tried to kill her for the throne, but she gutted him like a womp rat. The little weasel begged for his life like a coward, and was strung up in front of the palace, as a warning to others. He didn't die by her strike. He died by starvation and dehydration. Regardless of that, she got her happily ever after with someone who actually loved her, someone who, wouldn't let her die for no reason. The royal throne of Clan Kryze had to be rebuilt. It started with Satine and was forced to expand out. And just as Clan Kryze grew over the following decades and eventually centuries, so did the Empire. While Mandalore under Satine reached its highest peak ever, they never saw anything less than that ever again. Those that followed in Satine's footsteps would be pushed harder than their parents were ever pushed. The cycle started with the Duchess, and in only a few centuries, the Republic would shrink into a little bubble just on Coruscant, solely independent and cut off from the rest of the galaxy. The Mandalorians continued building a warrior society, constructing great wonders in the galaxy, eradicating Jedi rebels and fending off outside invaders. It was their cosmos, and they made it known. Strong alliances kept the Empire afloat, as Satine's great, and so on grandchildren would remain proud dukes and duchesses over their ever-growing, prosperous warrior empire. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, There Are Cars, The Shade of Fear, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexander Arista Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir Wellen 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny Naguin, Zanza Skeleton, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Magnetic Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Main 3 First Names, Darksaint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. Mandalore is a society that I find really interesting. It's kind of like Sparta, but like if you put Sparta in like 2025, which is really stupid in my opinion. So, as was said by Bo-Katan and the Mandalorian, Mandalore would survive if someone could walk both ways. I think the armorer said it as well. And so this entire video is focused on Satine being the one to walk both ways, because honestly, she deserves it more than Bo-Katan. That's just my opinion. Satine is the GOAT. And so, in the story, that's what she becomes. I'm obviously using a lot of references to Edge of Tomorrow, I think that the movie's called, the Tom Cruise movie where he just keeps doing Groundhog Day with the aliens. That's where the Angel of Sundari comes from. That was the big reference there. And so, you know, I'm kind of positioning Satine to be this warrior leader that has claimed the hearts of her people. She does that in the regular timeline anyways, but doing it with the warrior spin, essentially just turning the entire society into a true full-blown empire, and kind of pushing Mandalore to expand outwards. Using the Chiss and Mon Cala was one of my favorite attributes of the story, because those alliances just kind of make sense. I don't know why, they just feel like they fit naturally. And so you get Mandalore that's unstoppable. And so I hope you all enjoyed the story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.